All right, and welcome back to part three of the lecture on the Reformation. In the last part two that we left off with, we were talking about the spread of Protestant churches throughout all of Europe. And the last image we had looked at, which is this one here, is a map of France in the middle of the 16th century, 1562, and it shows you the extent and the spread of Protestant churches. And as you notice that there is a significant number of them concentrated in the south, but the other important element is the orange dots scattered throughout there, which are indications of Protestant churches that have several pastors. That in of itself is indicative of a large population of French Calvinists called Huguenots. You'll see the term on the next slide. The Huguenots, as what their name in France, had spread to a number of cities, and there were so many of them, the orange dots imply, that they required several pastors. So they had spread all throughout France. The Huguenots themselves, as your textbook points out, were often very well-to-do business, not always elites, but middle class to upper middle class French, and they had a fair amount of wealth, ran businesses, and were very prominent in their communities. Unfortunately for them, the dominant religion in France was still Catholicism, and that was controlled and adhered to by the state. So the King of France himself was Catholic and enforced Catholicism in France in order to maintain religious singularity. So, how does that work out in France? Well, part of the unintended consequences of the Reformation, as we've noted, are religious wars. This map here really shows you the divide between northern France, which was predominantly Catholic, and southern France, which was predominantly Huguenot. So you have a vast majority of Huguenots in the south, but you have a majority of Catholics in the north. Paris, the capital, is in the north, and that is relevant for our purposes here because it really means that there is a divide between northern and southern France, and France itself will be a battleground in the wars of religion. So in terms of religious warfare that takes place in France, we often refer to those, obviously, as the French Wars of Religion. And in these wars, when your textbook talks about this in more detail, but in these French Wars of Religion, you have French armies backed by the king and supported by the Pope, as well as by other powers, using their power, their prestige, their control of politics and the government to try and suppress the Huguenots. This all came to a head with the what's known as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Now, the first term you see there, you'd seen on your map, Huguenots. That's again the term for French Calvinists there. But on St. Bartholomew's Day, which was August 24th, 1572, the French monarchy, in part by the Queen Mother, were pushed to persecute the Huguenots. There essentially was a plan put into place to try and kill as many Huguenots as possible in France at a single moment. And that single moment became St. Bartholomew's Day in August 1572. The numbers are fairly staggering in terms of what the French Catholics pulled off. The numbers here that you see, 3,000 Paris, for example, that means that upwards of 3,000 Huguenots were dragged from their homes in Paris and murdered in the streets. So 3,000 in a single city. We aren't entirely certain of the numbers throughout the rest of France, but we know that they range at the low end at 10,000 Huguenots murdered, all the way up to perhaps even 70,000 Huguenots murdered. So this is why it's referred to as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It was thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Huguenots who were murdered, many of whom ultimately simply just fled France because they could not stay there, and it was a very intolerant place to be. When they did leave, they then took with them much of their wealth and business expertise, and so this was very damaging for France. Now, it will be another few decades before the French monarchy finally decides that this age of religious warfare is so damaging to France, to the government, to the economy, and everything that ultimately a French king, Henry, who is born a Huguenot, he's born a Calvinist, converts to Catholicism in order to appease France and not have it fall into absolute civil war. And in so doing, he uses his position as king to try to bring the two sides together, and so he issues what's known as the Edict of Nantes. In 1598, this is known as the Edict of Toleration, and it allows for toleration of the Calvinists in France. So it's meant to mean that the government will no longer persecute them for having a different a different belief than in this case that was Protestantism. This will stay in place for quite some time, actually, until the time of Louis XIV. Another of the unintended consequences, also in terms of warfare, was the Great War known as the 30 Years' War, which took place from 1618 to 1648, the majority of which took place in the area of the Holy Roman Empire and Germany. Now, your textbook will talk about the background to the war and who exactly was involved. It was the majority of the Western European powers, including many of those in Scandinavia. You had armies fighting all across Europe, particularly though in Germany, for a variety of reasons. Most of those reasons were religious, but often they were tied to political ideas of independence. For example, Bohemia wanted to be independent from other territories around it. Some of them wanted to maintain their Catholicism. Others wanted to promote Lutheranism. Still others were Calvinist. This is one of the greatest, in terms of size and magnitude, wars of religion. It is also basically the last war of religion in Europe. There will be, as you will see over the course of this class, there will be several more wars, numerous wars fought throughout European history, but the majority of those are not going to be fought after this point over religion. The 30 Years' War ends up being the main one, or the last of them. So one of the takeaways about the 30 Years' War, then, is that it is absolutely devastating to Europe. And this is one of the reasons we put it on the unintended consequences list. This was not something foreseen by Luther, or even Calvin or Zwingli, or even the Church when the Reformation started. In fact, nobody could have imagined the scale of devastation. The 30 Years' War, since it did last for 3 decades, as you can see by this map here, what this map shows you is the population loss in various parts of just Germany, based on percentages. So the percentage lost, if you look at some places, if you look at sort of the pink and yellow, pink shows sort of no change that they can perceive, so in some places of Austria. But if you look at yellow, yellow says perhaps up to 10% of the population died. So you can look at places like Saxony, up above Magdeburg. There you can see a couple spots where there was only a few, up to 10% death. Then you see other areas where the death toll could have been anywhere between 11 and 20%, but the majority of the areas in there, you can see large swaths of it in purple and red, which means the purple is somewhere between 40 and 50%, but the red is over 50% of the population dead during the 30 Years' War. So this was a massively destructive war of religion that ruined the lives of thousands upon thousands of Europeans. The money, the soldiers, the amount of time and effort put into this was absolutely devastating. Ultimately, the war was resolved. This last war of religion was resolved at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which for the most part was one of the conferences that ended up kind of drawing the most of the modern boundaries of Europe. And so it became an accord where people got together, Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, got together and resolved, at least on paper, many of their religious differences. And many of them agreed not to go to war again for religious reasons. So an unintended consequence, but a very devastating consequence. You can see on this map here, in terms of the spread of the 30 Years' War, just how many states were involved with it. And this is one from your textbook, so if you want to look at it more closely, you can. But you're looking at Austrian Habsburgs, Spanish Habsburgs, Prussians, Germans, Swedes, and you can see by the arrows on there that the French sent troops in. The French send troops into Spanish Habsburg lands, which they would like to control. They send troops into German states. The Swedish send troops into places like Westphalia and Prussian lands. You see troops coming back and forth between from Austria into German lands. There are incursions in parts of Italy and moving northward. So this again was sort of a prototype of a world war in a sense, because it was so massive here. Something that was a little bit different than if we turn to another unintended consequence, maybe less devastating for a population as a whole, was if we turn to England. Again, this is just sort of a cursory glance at what happens there. But if you look at the history of King Henry VIII, one of the reasons that he ends up breaking from the church in Rome has really very little to do with religion at all, and in fact has everything to do with wanting a male heir. Henry VIII is notorious for having numerous wives, many of whom met an unfortunate end. But in Henry's case, Henry wanted to seek a divorce from his wife and marry another woman, and the Pope refused to grant him that divorce. And so his response, and this is after Luther began his Reformation, Henry's response was to simply break away from Rome. And so what he breaks away and forms is what's known as the Anglican Church. Um, and the Anglican Church ends up being, in its early stages, very, very similar to, in fact, almost exactly the same as the Roman Church. They will do their liturgy in English, and there is no pope who is in charge of the church. And surprisingly, the person who becomes in charge, or perhaps not surprisingly, the person who comes in charge of the church is Henry VIII himself. So this places the king as the leader of the Anglican Church. But in terms of practice, in terms of many of the ceremonies and beliefs, there in the first few days or years of the Anglican Church, there's very little difference between Anglicans and Catholics. Really, the only difference is one has a pope, one does not. Other than that, they pretty much stay the same. And again, this is an unintended consequence where an entire nation, the nation of England, breaks away from Catholicism and essentially establishes its own version of Protestant Christianity. But in this case, it has nothing to do with Luther's ideas regarding the priesthood of all believers or sin. It really just simply has to do with the king wanting to be in charge of the church and, of course, have a male heir. So these are the variety of unintended consequences that are seen throughout the Reformation, whether it's something from the Peasants' War to break away Protestant groups like the Zwinglians or the Calvinists, or the wars of religion that take place in France, the massive wars of religion that take place in the 30 Years' War, or even England breaking away from the Catholic Church and establishing Anglicanism. These are all unintended consequences of what seemed to be, for Martin Luther all the way back in 1517, simply a small idea of reform and some questions to ask about the nature of the church. But it became so much more. And that's why, even though the Reformation was not intended to be a revolutionary movement, it became that through no fault of Luther's own, but it became that once it got out of Luther's hands. And so one of the things that we need to take away from all of this then is the drastic impact that the change had on Europe. If we look at this final map here, and again, this is one from your textbook, what you can see is just how radically Europe had changed, whereas prior to 1517, all of Europe, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Dutch republics, Austria, everything outside of essentially what you see as sort of the pink areas in the lower right-hand corner of the Ottoman Empire and up in Russia, all of that would have been green. It would have just been Catholic. Ireland, Scotland, England, Norway, all of those. But because, in part because of Luther's Reformation, and his ideas of reform, and then the unintended consequences of how rapidly it expanded outwards, you see this dramatic change. I mean, you look at the key at the map in the top left corner, you can see all of these different, what were called confessions, different faiths. So you have Catholic, right? But then you have Orthodox, who are sort of out of our scope of study here. But then you have Lutherans in the yellow, you have the Calvinists in the Swiss Confederation, the Dutch Republic, and Scotland. You have the Anglicans in England. And you also have a number of the Calvinists spread throughout France, which look like small hash marks on your side there. But that's really the impact of the Reformation, is that it dramatically changes the face of religion in Europe, when it'll never be the same after this. They can never sort of put the Reformation genie back in the bottle. All right, so that's where we're going to end this lecture on the Reformation. The next ones will pick up next week.